Please, you must listen to me. It's not safe here anymore. They know you're here. We have to go right now.
The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when Dr. Sarah Chen first heard the sound that would unravel everything she thought she knew about existence. It wasn't loud. That's what she would tell the committee later, during the hearings that would never be made public. It was a hum, low, persistent, like the resonance of a tuning fork pressed against bone. It came from the forest behind the SETI outpost in the Cascade Mountains, where she'd spent the last 8 years listening to cosmic silence. She'd been alone that night. Martin had driven down to Portland for supplies, and the November cold had settled into the equipment room like an uninvited guest. The signal analyzer showed nothing unusual, no electromagnetic anomalies, no radio bursts, just that sound, organic, almost biological, coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. Sarah was 43, methodical to a fault, and had long ago made peace with the probability that her life's work would yield nothing but statistical noise. She'd abandoned the romanticism of contact years ago. What remained was pure process. Listen, record, analyze, repeat. But this wasn't coming through the radio array. She pulled on her weatherproof jacket and grabbed the portable spectrometer, more out of habit than hope. The forest was ink black beyond the compound lights, the Douglas firs forming a wall of shadow that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. She should have waited for Martin. Protocol dictated a 2-person team for any field investigation. She didn't wait. The hum grew stronger as she moved deeper into the woods, her headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Moss hung from branches like wet cloth. Her boots made no sound on the carpet of pine needles. The air smelled of decay and rain and something else, something metallic, like ozone after lightning. Then she saw it. Not a craft, not a light in the sky, but a shape, angular, impossible, resting in a clearing where no clearing had been that morning. It looked less like it had landed and more like it had always been there, camouflaged by some technology that bent perception itself. And standing before it, illuminated by a bioluminescent glow that seemed to emanate from its own skin, was something that made every certainty in Sarah's mind collapse like a dying star. It was waiting for her. It had been waiting for a very long time. Sarah's training took over before conscious thought could paralyze her. She raised the spectrometer with shaking hands, capturing wavelengths that shouldn't exist in nature. The readings made no sense. The entity before her registered simultaneously as organic matter, crystalline structure, and something the sensors couldn't classify at all. It was roughly humanoid, but only in the way a child's drawing suggests a person. 7 feet tall, limbs too long, and joints that bent in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin, if that's what it was, shifted between translucent and opaque, revealing suggestions of systems beneath that looked nothing like organs. No face in the traditional sense. Just a smooth surface where features might have been, with 2 dark apertures that could have been eyes or something else entirely. It didn't move, didn't communicate, simply stood there in a posture that somehow conveyed patience. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but something stronger kept her rooted. The scientist's hunger for understanding that had driven her entire adult life. She thought of Carl Sagan's words. Somewhere, something incredible is waiting to be known. This was that something. Can you understand me? Her voice sounded small in the clearing, swallowed by the rain and the hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The entity tilted its head, or what served as a head, in a gesture that felt distinctly curious. Then something extraordinary happened. The air between them began to shimmer and symbols appeared, floating like projections, but existing in 3-dimensional space. They weren't written in any alphabet Sarah recognized, yet somehow, impossibly, she understood them. Not language, not exactly. It was more like pure concept, meaning without the filter of words. And what she understood made her knees weak. We seeded you, long ago, in what you call the Cambrian. Sarah's mind reeled. The Cambrian explosion, 540 million years ago, when complex life suddenly diversified in Earth's oceans. Every biology textbook called it one of evolution's great mysteries. You created us? Not created, initiated. One of many experiments across many worlds. Introducing genetic templates, observing, documenting. The symbols shifted, forming images now. Oceans teeming with strange life, primordial and violent. Then those same oceans empty, then filled again with new forms. The progression wasn't natural evolution. It was intervention, repeated and systematic. Why? Sarah whispered. The entity's response carried something that felt like melancholy. To understand consciousness, to see if awareness could emerge from chaos. Your world was selected because your star is stable. Your planet sits in the narrow band where water remains liquid. We planted the seeds and left markers to track progress. Markers? The symbols reformed into DNA helices, but highlighted in ways Sarah had never seen, sections of so-called junk DNA that served no apparent function, lighting up like circuit boards. Non-coding sequences, she breathed. You're saying that's your, what, signature? Yes, and timer, and warning. That last word hung in the air like a threat. Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand up beneath her jacket. What kind of warning? The entity moved for the first time, turning toward the ship, or structure, or whatever it was. The bioluminescent glow pulsed in rhythms that Sarah's trained mind immediately recognized as data patterns. Binary, fractal, musical. We have conducted 847 experiments on worlds like yours, seeding, observing, waiting for intelligence to emerge. Of those 847, the pause felt eternal. You are the 23rd to develop technology capable of self-destruction before developing wisdom. Sarah felt cold that had nothing to do with the November rain. The others, what happened to them? They are gone. By their own hands, nuclear fire, biological weapons, atmospheric collapse, environmental cascade. Each time the pattern is the same, intelligence emerges, tribes form, tribes conflict. Technology outpaces ethics. The timer embedded in your code was meant to track this progression. Timer to what? Sarah's voice was barely audible. To us. When you reach the threshold, splitting the atom, leaving your planet, beginning to ask the right questions, the signal activated, calling us back to observe the outcome. And now you're here to... what? Judge us? The symbols that formed in response carried something that might have been sadness. No, to document the end, to record what went wrong, to take samples before the collapse, and then to abandon this experiment as we abandoned the others. Sarah felt tears on her face, mixing with the rain. You're saying we're doomed? That it's inevitable? Every species reaches this point, the filter between primitive and transcendent. Most fail. Your conflicts accelerate. Your climate destabilizes. Your weapons proliferate. We have seen this 22 times before. The pattern is clear. But some passed? You said 23rd of 847. That means... Sarah's mind calculated frantically. That means others made it through. Others survived. The entity's stillness somehow conveyed surprise. Yes, 31 species have passed through the filter, but they are exceptions, anomalies in the data. Your pattern matches the failures, not the successes. Sarah wiped her face, her training reasserting itself even in the face of cosmic despair. Then there's something different about the ones who made it, some variable you haven't identified, some factor that determines success or failure. We have studied every variable. Genetics, environment, resource distribution, social structures. The successful species show no consistent pattern we can predict. Then maybe, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, maybe you're asking the wrong questions. The entity tilted its head again, and Sarah had the distinct impression that for the first time in this encounter, she had said something unexpected. The rain had become a mist by the time Sarah convinced the entity to follow her back to the outpost. It moved without sound, its feet, or what served as feet, barely disturbing the forest floor. The ship remained in the clearing, its presence somehow unobtrusive despite its impossible geometry, as if reality had made room for it and then forgotten to question the arrangement. Martin's truck wasn't back yet. Sarah had maybe 2 hours before she'd have to explain why there was an alien in their laboratory. The equipment room felt suddenly small and primitive with the entity inside it. It had to stoop beneath the ceiling, its elongated form creating shadows that defied the room's fluorescent lighting. Sarah moved to her workstation, pulling up files she'd accumulated over years of research. Not SETI data, but something else she'd been compiling quietly, almost obsessively. You said you've studied every variable, Sarah began, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Genetics, environment, resources, social structures. But what about stories? The entity's head tilt conveyed what she interpreted as confusion. Narratives, Sarah clarified, pulling up document after document. Mythology, religion, art, philosophy. The things we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're supposed to do. You're looking at us like we're a biological system, but we're also a mimetic one. We don't just pass on genes, we pass on ideas. She brought up a comparative analysis she'd been working on, mapping the correlation between civilizational collapse and the dominant narratives of those civilizations. The Mayans, the Romans, Easter Island. The patterns were there, subtle but consistent. Every species that collapsed told itself the same essential story, that resources were infinite, that growth was paramount, that their way of life was permanent and unassailable. They couldn't imagine their own ending until it was too late. The symbols appeared in the air beside her screen, overlaying her data with information from the other 22 failed experiments. Sarah's breath caught. The entity was showing her their stories, or what passed for stories in species so alien she could barely process them. But the patterns... Oh my God, she whispered. They all told themselves variations of the same narrative. The dominance myth, the exceptionalism myth, The growth at all costs myth. This is not a variable we tracked. Stories are ephemeral, not measurable like DNA or carbon emissions. But they're not ephemeral. Sarah's voice rose with urgency. They're the most powerful force in any civilization. They determine what we think is possible, what we think is necessary, what we think is worth preserving. Show me the species that survived. The air filled with new data, 31 civilizations that had passed through the filter. Sarah's eyes darted across the information, looking for the patterns she knew had to be there. And then she saw it. They changed their stories, she breathed. Look, every single successful species went through a narrative revolution right before the critical threshold. They stopped telling themselves stories about conquest and started telling stories about coexistence. They stopped measuring success by growth and started measuring it by sustainability. They stopped seeing themselves as separate from their environment and started seeing themselves as part of it. This is possible. The entity's symbols carried uncertainty for the first time. But how do you measure the strength of a story? How do you predict which narratives will take hold? You can't, Sarah admitted. That's the point. It's not deterministic like physics. It's emergent, chaotic. It depends on individuals making choices that ripple outward. Artists, teachers, leaders, people willing to tell a different story and make others believe it. She turned to face the entity fully, her exhaustion forgotten in the rush of understanding. You've been treating this like a biological experiment, waiting to see if the organisms will adapt. But we're not just organisms. We're meaning-making creatures. We live in the stories we tell ourselves, and we can change those stories. That's the variable you haven't been tracking, the capacity for narrative transformation. But your current narratives are leading to collapse. Your media amplifies conflict. Your economic systems demand infinite growth. Your political structures reward short-term thinking. The pattern is clear. The pattern is clear if you're only looking at the loudest voices, Sarah countered. But there are other stories being told. Stories about regeneration, about cooperation, about long-term thinking. They're quieter, but they're growing. And if you're here to document our collapse, then you're missing the most important part of the experiment. She pulled up her chair, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was about to propose. What if you stayed? Not to observe us passively, but to participate. To tell us what you've learned from the others. To help us understand which stories lead to survival and which lead to extinction. You said 31 species made it through. We could learn from them. We are observers, not interventionists. To interfere would contaminate the data. The data is already contaminated. Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. You seeded us in the first place. You set this entire experiment in motion. And now you're going to walk away and let us die because you want to maintain scientific objectivity? The entity was silent for a long moment. The symbols faded. When they returned, they carried something Sarah hadn't felt from it before. Something that might have been doubt. We abandoned the 22 failures because we believed their extinction was inevitable. But if you're correct about narrative transformation, if that is the unmeasured variable, then we may have abandoned species that could have been saved. The implications of that statement hung between them like a physical presence. Civilizations extinguished. Billions of lives across dozens of worlds, ended not by inevitable collapse, but by the observer's incomplete understanding. Then don't make the same mistake with us, Sarah said quietly. Stay, watch. But this time, help us see what we're missing. Give us the chance you didn't give the others. The entity turned toward the window, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to gray the sky. There is precedent for reconsidering abandoned experiments. But the decision is not mine alone. Others are coming. The documentation team. They will arrive when your sun rises fully. You must convince them. How many? 12. Each representing a different research focus. Biology, sociology, technology, psychology. Others you have no names for. If you can convince them that narrative transformation is possible, that you can change your stories before the collapse, they may grant you more time. Sarah looked at her watch. 90 minutes until full sunrise. 90 minutes to prepare the most important presentation of her life, for all their lives. Martin found her at dawn, surrounded by printouts and projection diagrams, practicing words that felt simultaneously inadequate and essential. Sarah? He stood in the doorway, coffee forgotten in his hand, staring at the entity that occupied the center of their laboratory like a statue carved from light and uncertainty. What the actual... Martin, I need you to listen very carefully. Sarah's voice was steady, despite running on pure adrenaline. Everything we thought we knew about human origins is wrong. We're not a random accident of evolution. We're an experiment, and according to our visitors, we're a failed one. She watched her colleague's face cycle through disbelief, fear, and finally, because Martin was a scientist to his core, burning curiosity. She'd chosen him as her partner for a reason. Visitors? Plural? 12 more arriving in... She checked her watch. 73 minutes. We have that long to convince them we're worth saving. Saving from what? Ourselves? She brought him up to speed with brutal efficiency, showing him the data the entity had shared, the patterns across 847 worlds, the 22 failures and 31 successes. Martin absorbed it with the same methodical focus he brought to every problem, but she could see the existential dread building behind his eyes. So, we're on trial, he said finally, for crimes we haven't committed yet. Not crimes, inevitabilities. They think our collapse is deterministic, that we're following the same path as the others, but I think there's a way to prove them wrong. In 72 minutes, Martin set down his coffee and rolled up his sleeves. Then we better get started. They worked in tandem, Sarah compiling evidence of narrative transformation across human history while Martin set up the holographic projectors they'd normally use for visualizing radio signals. The entity watched in silence, occasionally offering data that Sarah integrated into her presentation. At precisely 6:47 a.m., the sky above the outpost began to shimmer. 11 more ships materialized, smaller than the first, but no less impossible. They descended without sound, settling into a formation that suggested deliberation rather than threat. The entity beside Sarah straightened, the first time she'd seen it change posture. They are here, the documentation team. What you say now will determine whether humanity receives intervention or abandonment. The air in the laboratory began to fill with presences, not physical in the way the first entity was physical, but there nonetheless. Consciousnesses occupying space, observing from dimensions Sarah's senses could barely register. The symbols appeared, now in multiple colors, representing different voices in a conversation she was only partially equipped to follow. But she understood the core question, projected in a way that bypassed language entirely. Why should this experiment continue? Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling, her voice steady. Because you're missing the most important variable in your data. You've tracked our biology, our technology, our resource consumption, but you haven't tracked our stories, the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. The symbol shifted, conveying skepticism. Stories are not predictive. They are subjective phenomena without measurable impact on survival outcomes. That's where you're wrong. Sarah activated the projectors, filling the room with images and data. Stories are the most powerful force in any civilization because they determine what we think is possible. Let me show you something. She brought up the historical record. Human civilizations on the brink, again and again, and the narrative shifts that pulled them back. The abolition of slavery, once considered economically necessary. Women's suffrage, once thought to threaten social order. The end of colonialism, the environmental movement, civil rights, each one impossible until enough people started telling a different story. We're a species that changes our minds, Sarah said. It's not smooth, it's not fast, but it happens. Show me. In all your 22 failures, did any of them have documented cases of large-scale narrative transformation? Of foundational beliefs being overturned? The entity consulted with its companions, symbols flashing in rapid exchange. Then, 3 species showed minor ideological shifts, but they were insufficient to prevent collapse. Because they didn't have what we have now, instantaneous global communication, the ability to share new stories across the entire species in real time. For the first time in our history, a narrative transformation can spread at the speed of light. We're uniquely positioned for the kind of change that could save us. Martin jumped in, his enthusiasm overriding his fear. Look at the last decade alone. Climate consciousness went from fringe to mainstream. Plant-based diets exploded in popularity. Renewable energy became economically viable. These are signs of a story changing, from human dominion over nature to human participation within nature. It's happening right now, even as our systems strain toward collapse. But your emissions continue to rise. Your weapons proliferate. Your conflicts intensify. The macro trends indicate failure, regardless of minor ideological shifts. Because the old story is still dominant, Sarah acknowledged. The narrative of infinite growth, of human exceptionalism, of short-term profit over long-term survival. But stories don't change all at once. They change person by person, community by community. And right now, we're in the middle of that transformation. The question isn't whether we're doomed, the question is whether we're being given enough time to let the new story take hold. She took a breath, steadying herself for the most important point. You said 31 species survived. That means survival is possible. It's not a biological certainty that intelligence leads to self-destruction. There's a path through the filter. And if we're in the process of changing our stories, if we're undergoing narrative transformation right now, then you're not observing a failed experiment. You're observing a species in transition. And if you abandon us now, you'll never know which way we would have gone. The silence that followed felt like the space between heartbeats, stretched to infinity. Then the symbols reformed, and Sarah felt something she hadn't expected from beings capable of seeding worlds with life. You present a compelling argument, but arguments are not evidence. Can you demonstrate that humans are capable of the rapid narrative transformation required for survival? Can you show us the mechanism by which stories change? Sarah looked at Martin. Martin looked at the entity, and then Sarah realized what she had to do. Give me 24 hours, she said. Let me tell this story, your story, our story, to the world. Let me activate the mechanism you want to see. If I can trigger a narrative shift with this information, if I can prove that stories can change quickly enough to matter, will you grant us more time? The documentation team conferred in colors and dimensions Sarah couldn't fully perceive. Finally, 24 hours, tell your story, show us that humans can change their narrative. If you succeed, we will stay. We will share what we learned from the 31 survivors. We will guide rather than abandon. But if you fail, if your species cannot integrate this truth, cannot shift its dominant narratives, then we will document your end and move on to other worlds. Sarah felt the weight of 8 billion lives settle onto her shoulders. I'll need access to your data, everything you have on the species that survived, and I'll need proof, something that validates my claims to the scientific community. The first entity stepped forward, and for the first time, something that might have been warmth emanated from it. You have earned that much. We will provide evidence. The rest depends on whether humans are truly a meaning-making species or merely biological machines following programming toward inevitable collapse. Sarah turned to Martin. Get me every contact we have. Every journalist, every scientist, every podcaster, every influencer who might listen. We have 24 hours to change the story humanity tells itself. And if we can't? Sarah looked at the entities filling their laboratory, representatives of a perspective so vast it made her consciousness ache. Then, at least we'll have tried. At least they'll document that some of us, right at the end, understood what we needed to become. The next 3 hours were a controlled frenzy of documentation and decision-making that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. The entity, she'd started thinking of it as first contact, though it had no name in any sense she understood, provided her with data that should have required decades to analyze. But it came formatted in a way her mind could instantly grasp, as if the information was being uploaded directly into her consciousness. She saw the 31 successful species, their turning points, their narrative shifts, the precise moments when they chose survival over dominance. One aquatic civilization that had nearly destroyed their ocean ecosystem until their artists began creating works that depicted water not as resource, but as sacred ancestor. Within 2 generations, their entire industrial system had transformed. A hive-minded species that had been warring with a neighboring hive for resources until a single individual drone broke protocol and composed a musical pattern that both hives recognized as beautiful. The wars ended. Cooperation began. A technological species, not unlike humans, that had reached their atomic age and teetered on the brink of nuclear war until a scientist, always a scientist, Sarah noted with grim satisfaction, broadcast evidence of their common genetic origin to both sides. The weapons were dismantled. Each story different, each story pointing to the same truth. Narrative transformation was possible, but it required 3 elements: truth, urgency, and a messenger people would trust. Sarah had truth. She had urgency, but trust? She looked at her reflection in the dark computer screen. A 43-year-old researcher most people had never heard of, about to claim contact with aliens who said humanity was doomed unless we changed our stories. In the age of deepfakes and disinformation, who would believe her? We need verification, Martin said, reading her thoughts. Multiple independent sources confirming the same story. Otherwise, this gets buried as a hoax before it spreads. The entities could appear publicly, Sarah suggested. A mass landing, undeniable proof. No, the symbols flashed with unusual intensity. If we appear en masse, humans will respond with fear and military action. Your governments will seize control of the narrative. The story will become about invasion, not transformation. You must be the messenger. Then give me something that can't be faked, something that proves this is real. First Contact conferred with the documentation team, symbols flashing in rapid exchange that Sarah's augmented comprehension could barely follow. Then, we can provide genetic evidence. Your junk DNA contains sequences that match no terrestrial evolutionary pattern. We can activate specific markers that will be detectable by your laboratories worldwide. It will take 12 hours for your scientists to verify, but the proof will be irrefutable. Do it. But understand, once this is released, there is no controlling the narrative. Some will react with wonder, others with terror. Your governments will scramble for advantage. Religious institutions will fracture. The social instability could accelerate your collapse rather than prevent it. Sarah's finger hovered over her keyboard, frozen by the enormity of the decision. She thought of Oppenheimer watching the first atomic test. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. She was about to detonate a truth bomb that could shatter every foundation of human self-understanding. "Martin," she said quietly, "if this goes wrong, if this triggers panic or violence or wars, it's on me, Bemittel. You can walk away right now. Say you had no part in it." Her colleague didn't hesitate. "We're scientists, Sarah. We report what we find. This is what we found." She nodded and began to type. The press release was simple, almost clinical. It outlined her credentials, described the contact, and made 3 specific claims that could be independently verified. First, that non-coding DNA sequences would show non-terrestrial patterns when analyzed correctly. Second, that these sequences would activate at precisely 14 Ograsa GMT, producing detectable chemical signatures in human cells worldwide. Third, that she had evidence of 847 other seeded worlds, and would release comparative data to any credentialed scientific institution willing to examine it. She sent it simultaneously to every major news outlet, scientific journal, and astronomy department in the world. Then she posted it on social media, tagged every science communicator she could think of, and waited. The response was immediate and bifurcated. Half the internet dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. The other half began analyzing the claims with the kind of intensity that only collective human curiosity could generate. Within 90 minutes, 3 independent genetics labs had requested her raw data. By noon, the first laboratory confirmed the non-terrestrial patterns in the non-coding sequences. By 13:00, the confirmation had been replicated by 7 more institutions. At 13:47, the World Health Organization issued a statement urging calm and requesting that all genetic research facilities monitor for the predicted activation event at 14:00. Sarah watched the clock. Martin paced. The entities remained perfectly still, observing with an intensity that felt like pressure against her skin. At 14 GMT, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, something happened in the DNA of every human being on Earth. The junk sequences activated. Sarah's phone exploded with notifications. Laboratories from Tokyo to Toronto to Johannesburg reported identical findings. The dormant sequences had produced a brief pulse of bioluminescent proteins, detectable but harmless, impossible to fake or fabricate. A signature that said, "We were here" in a language written in nucleotides. Proof. The internet caught fire. Within an hour, contact proven was trending worldwide. News channels interrupted regular programming. Scientists who had dismissed her claim 12 hours ago were now scrambling to understand its implications. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from apocalyptic to welcoming. World leaders scheduled emergency sessions. And in Sarah's laboratory, First Contact displayed a new symbol she hadn't seen before. She understood it immediately. Now comes the hard part. "The proof was easy," Sarah said aloud, watching the chaos unfold across a dozen screens. "Making them understand what it means, making them choose transformation over fear, that's where we find out if we're worth saving." Martin pulled up global sentiment analysis. The data was not encouraging. For every person responding with wonder and curiosity, another responded with fear and anger. Conspiracy theories spread as fast as facts, calls for military readiness, demands to capture the entities, panic buying, market volatility, the pattern of the 22 failures beginning to emerge. "You have 16 hours remaining," the documentation team communicated. "The narrative is fragmenting. You have provided truth, but truth alone does not change stories. What will you do now?" Sarah stared at the screens, at the beautiful, terrible chaos of humanity confronting its own origin story, and realized she'd been thinking about this all wrong. She didn't need to convince everyone. She just needed to convince enough people, the early adopters, the storytellers, the ones who could carry the new narrative forward even after she couldn't. "Martin, get me a live stream set up. Worldwide broadcast. I need to speak directly to anyone who's listening." "Sarah, you're exhausted. You haven't slept, maybe?" "There's no time for maybe. We have 16 hours to change 8 billion minds. I need to start now." She turned to First Contact. "And I need you beside me. Not hiding, not invisible. If we're going to ask humanity to embrace a new story, they need to see who's telling it." The entity's hesitation was palpable. "We are observers. To appear is to interfere. You already interfered. 540 million years ago when you seeded this planet. Now you get to see if that interference was worth it," the documentation team conferred. Then, slowly, First Contact moved to stand beside her, its bioluminescent form creating shadows that physics shouldn't allow. "Very well. Tell your story, Sarah Chen. Show us what happens when humans are given truth with urgency from a messenger they might trust. Show us if narrative transformation is real." Sarah opened the live stream, saw the viewer count climb instantly into the millions, and began to speak. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and 12 hours ago I was contacted by representatives of a civilization that seeded life on Earth 540 million years ago. The viewer count hit 10 million, 20 million, 50 million. The comments section scrolled too fast to read. A blur of disbelief, curiosity, fear, wonder. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. But look at your genetic test results. Every one of you who checked their DNA today found the activation sequence. That wasn't a hoax. That wasn't explicable by terrestrial evolution. That was proof. She gestured to first contact, standing beside her in its impossible geometry. The being's bioluminescence created an otherworldly backdrop that no special effects team could replicate. They've seeded 847 worlds like ours. Experiments to see if consciousness can emerge from chaos, if intelligence can transcend its biological imperatives. Of those experiments, 22 have failed. Their civilizations collapsed, not from external threats, but from internal contradictions, from the stories they told themselves about growth, dominance, and exceptionalism. 100 million viewers. News networks were simulcasting her feed. She could feel the weight of attention like a physical force. But 31 experiments succeeded. 31 species made it through what they call the filter, the transition from primitive intelligence to transcendent consciousness. And I've spent the last 6 hours studying what made them different. She brought up the holographic displays, showing the data First Contact had provided. Viewers worldwide saw alien civilizations at their turning points, rendered in visual metaphors their minds could grasp. Every successful species went through a narrative revolution. They changed the fundamental stories they told themselves about their place in the universe, and they did it right at the moment of crisis, right when their technology became powerful enough to destroy them. The comments were evolving. Less mockery now, more engagement, questions, genuine questions. We're at that moment now. Climate collapse, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, biological weapons. We have the technology to end ourselves a dozen different ways. And according to our visitors, we're following the exact pattern of the 22 failures. Unless we change our story. She paused, letting that sink in. But here's what they didn't understand, what I had to show them. Humans are uniquely positioned for rapid narrative transformation. We have global communication. We have 8 billion minds connected in real time. We have art and science and philosophy all working together. For the first time in our history, a new story can spread across the entire species at the speed of light. 200 million viewers. She could see her words being translated into dozens of languages, spreading through social networks faster than any broadcast in human history. So here's the story we need to tell ourselves. We are not alone. We never were. We're part of a universe filled with consciousness, with experiments in awareness, with species asking the same questions we ask. And our survival depends not on dominating nature or each other, but on joining a community of minds that chose cooperation over conquest. She felt Martin's hand on her shoulder, supporting her as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. The old story said we were exceptional, that Earth was the center, that humans were the pinnacle, that growth was infinite and resources were unlimited. That story is killing us. It's the same story that killed 22 other civilizations. First Contact began to glow brighter, and Sarah understood that the documentation team was paying very close attention now. The news story says we're participants in something larger, that consciousness is the universe becoming aware of itself, that our value isn't in dominating but in understanding, that the greatest achievement of intelligence is not power but wisdom. 300 million viewers. Global social media had effectively stopped for this moment. Even the stock markets had paused. I can't force you to believe this story. I can only show you the evidence and ask you to consider what it means. The proof is in your DNA, literally written into your cells. The choice is in your hands. Do we continue the pattern that's destroyed 22 civilizations? Or do we become the 32nd success? She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the final push. Our visitors gave us 24 hours to prove that narrative transformation is real, that humans can change their story fast enough to matter. We have 8 hours left. In that time, I'm asking you to do something revolutionary. Talk to each other, not at each other, not past each other. Actually, listen and share and imagine what could be different if we chose a different story. The fatigue hit her like a wave, but she pushed through. If you're a scientist, verify this data and share your findings honestly. If you're an artist, create something that captures this moment of change. If you're a teacher, help others understand. If you're a parent, think about what story you want your children to inherit. If you're a leader, make decisions based on long-term survival rather than short-term gain. 400 million viewers. The largest audience in human history, all focused on a single question. Can we change? The entities watching us want to know if rapid narrative transformation is possible. So let's show them. Let's show them that humans can look at the truth, even when it's terrifying, and choose wisdom over fear. Let's prove that consciousness matters, that stories matter, that we're more than just biological machines following programming toward collapse. She felt tears on her face and didn't wipe them away. We've been an abandoned experiment, but maybe, Just maybe, we can become something else, something these observers have never seen before. A species that heard it was doomed and decided to rewrite the ending. First contact moved closer, and Sarah felt, rather than heard, its approval. I'm going to keep this stream open. For the next 8 hours, I'll be here, answering questions, sharing data, talking with anyone who wants to understand, because that's how narratives change, one conversation at a time, one mind at a time, until suddenly the impossible becomes inevitable. She looked directly into the camera, speaking to every human on Earth who was listening. We were seated as an experiment in consciousness. Let's show them what conscious beings can do when they choose to transform. Let's become the story that changes everything. The stream hit 500 million viewers, and Sarah Chen, 43-year-old SETI researcher who'd spent 8 years listening to cosmic silence, became the voice of humanity's narrative revolution. The response came in waves, each more complex than the last. Within the first hour, the scientific community mobilized with unprecedented coordination. The genetic data was uploaded to open-source platforms. Thousands of researchers worldwide began analyzing the non-terrestrial sequences, verifying the activation patterns, mapping the implications. Nature and Science announced joint emergency publications. The Journal of Astrobiology crashed from traffic overload. Dr. James Morrison from MIT was the first to go on record. The patterns in the non-coding sequences are mathematically elegant in ways evolution never produces. This is engineered. This is intentional. This is proof. But proof wasn't enough to override fear. The second wave was political, and it was ugly. Within 2 hours, emergency sessions convened at the United Nations, NATO, and regional power blocks. Sarah watched the feeds with growing dread as rhetoric escalated. China's UN ambassador demanded the entities be detained and studied. Russia's representative called for immediate militarization of the response. The U.S., President, to Sarah's surprise, urged caution and dialogue, but was immediately contradicted by the Pentagon releasing a statement about national security implications. They're doing exactly what you predicted, Martin said, watching the diplomatic chaos unfold. Treating this as a threat instead of an opportunity. But the third wave gave Sarah hope. Artists were the first to truly understand. A musician in Lagos composed a piece called Consciousness Singing that incorporated the mathematical patterns from the DNA sequences. It went viral in minutes. A muralist in São Paulo began painting a massive piece showing humans and aliens as parallel branches on a tree of consciousness. Poets in Tehran, dancers in Tokyo, filmmakers in Los Angeles, creativity exploded across the planet as people tried to process what they'd learned. The fourth wave was religious, and it was fracturing in real time. Sarah watched as denominations split, leaders issued contradictory statements, and congregations gathered in confusion and wonder. Some declared the entities demonic, others saw them as angels. A rabbi in Jerusalem gave an impromptu sermon suggesting that perhaps humans had always been made in the image of God, but that image was of consciousness itself, not form. It was viewed 20 million times in the first hour. 5 hours into her stream, with 3 hours remaining until the documentation team's deadline, Sarah's exhaustion was absolute. Martin had brought her coffee, food, stimulants. She'd accepted all of it and felt none of it working. But the comments kept coming, and she kept answering. A teenager in Mumbai asked, "If we're an experiment, do we have free will?" Sarah looked at First Contact, who displayed symbols that she translated in real time. The experiment isn't about whether you have free will, it's about what you choose to do with it. Every successful species chose wisely. Every failed species chose poorly. The choice has always been yours. A climate scientist in Berlin asked, "How do the successful species handle environmental collapse?" "They stop treating their planet as a resource and start treating it as part of themselves," Sarah answered, pulling up the relevant data. "Look at this aquatic species. They transformed their industrial base not through regulation, but through narrative. Once they believed water was ancestor rather than resource, the economic models changed to reflect that belief." A military strategist in Virginia asked, "What if we don't want to change? What if some nations decide that dominance is worth the risk?" Sarah paused, feeling the weight of that question. "Then those nations will follow the pattern of the failures. But here's what the data shows. In every case where even a minority of the population embraced transformation, it was enough to shift the entire civilization. You don't need unanimous consent, you just need critical mass." The stream was now at 700 million concurrent viewers, with billions more catching highlights and translations. The conversation was happening everywhere simultaneously, in homes, schools, mosques, churches, temples, laboratories, government buildings. Humanity was having its first truly global dialogue. And slowly, Sarah began to see the pattern shift. A group of major corporations announced a joint sustainability initiative that went beyond performative environmentalism. Actual restructuring, actual sacrifice of short-term profit for long-term survival. 12 countries simultaneously announced they were halting fossil fuel subsidies and redirecting funds to renewable research. The EU passed emergency legislation recognizing rights of future generations in current policymaking. 3 nuclear powers opened backdoor channels to discuss cooperative disarmament. Small changes, insufficient on their own, but happening simultaneously, driven by a shared narrative that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. Martin grabbed Sarah's arm. Look at the sentiment analysis. The global mood tracking showed a dramatic shift. Fear was still present, but wonder was growing faster. Anger was being replaced by curiosity. Denial was giving way to acceptance. The curve was bending. It's working, Sarah whispered. The story is changing. But first contact symbols carried a warning. 2 hours remain. And your governments are mobilizing military assets. There are those who see us as threats to be eliminated, not partners to be understood. The old narrative is not dead, it is fighting back. Sarah looked at the military tracking data. Fighter jets scrambling. Missile systems going to elevated readiness. Generals overriding politicians. The pattern of the failures trying to reassert itself. Then we need to give them something the military can't shoot down, Sarah said. We need to show them what success looks like. Can you project the images from the 31 successful species? Let people see what we could become? The documentation team conferred, and then the sky above every major city on Earth began to shimmer. Not with ships, not with weapons, but with visions. People looked up and saw other worlds, other species, other civilizations that had faced the same choice and chosen wisdom. They saw aquatic beings who'd learned to see water as sacred, hive minds who'd chosen cooperation, technological species who'd dismantled their weapons and reached for the stars. They saw what humanity could become if the new story won. The military mobilizations slowed. Generals paused. Politicians hesitated, because it's harder to shoot at hope than at fear. And in that moment of hesitation, something unprecedented happened. 8 billion humans, connected by technology and witnessing the same revelation simultaneously, felt the story change. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. The final hour arrived not with drama, but with stillness. Sarah's stream had become a global meditation. Millions watching in silence as the visions played overhead, as the data scrolled past, as humanity collectively held its breath and wondered what came next. First contact stood beside her, the bioluminescent glow steady now, patient. The documentation team had withdrawn their projections from the sky, leaving only the questions they'd asked humanity to answer. Can you change your story? Can you change it fast enough? Are you worth saving? At 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time, 23 hours and 47 minutes after Sarah first entered the forest, the documentation team manifested in full. Not physically, they remained in their ships, but their presence filled the air like a frequency Sarah could feel in her bones. The symbols appeared, massive and unmistakable, visible to everyone watching the stream. We have observed, we have documented, we have analyzed. Sarah felt her heart hammering. Martin gripped her hand. 1 billion people held their breath. In the past 24 hours, you have demonstrated the following. First, the capacity to accept uncomfortable truths without complete social collapse. Despite fear and confusion, your institutions have maintained function. This is notable. Second, the ability to coordinate globally around shared ideas. Your communication networks enabled narrative spread that would have taken centuries in previous eras. This is unprecedented in our data. Third, evidence of behavioral change motivated by new understanding. Multiple governments, corporations, and individuals have taken actions contradicting their previous patterns. This suggests plasticity, not inevitability. Sarah felt tears building again, but didn't dare interrupt. Fourth, creative integration of new information. Your artists, teachers, and storytellers have begun weaving this revelation into frameworks your species can understand and remember. This is the mechanism of narrative transformation we were uncertain existed. However, we have also observed resistance from power structures invested in old narratives, military mobilization, attempts to contain or weaponize this information, the pattern of the failures still present, widespread fear and confusion, easily exploitable by those who benefit from dominance paradigms. The fragility of your new story, it exists now, but whether it can survive long enough to transform behavior at scale remains uncertain. The pause felt eternal. We have reached a decision. Sarah closed her eyes, preparing for the verdict on humanity's worth. You are not a failed experiment. You are an experiment in progress. Her eyes snapped open. The capacity for rapid narrative transformation is real. You have proven this in 24 hours, but you have also proven that transformation is vulnerable, contested, and far from complete. Therefore, we will not abandon you. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through every human watching, as if the species itself had exhaled in relief. but neither will we intervene directly. We will not provide advanced technology or solve your problems. That would make you dependent, not transcendent. Instead, we offer this. We will remain in orbit, observable but not intrusive. We will serve as a reminder of what you learned today, that you are not alone, that other species have faced this choice, that survival is possible. We will share the stories of the 31 successful civilizations, not their technology, not their solutions, but their narratives, how they thought about their problems, what values guided their choices, what stories they told themselves during transformation. And we will monitor your progress, not as judges, but as observers who have invested 540 million years in your potential and are curious to see what you become. Sarah felt something breaking inside her, the tension of the last day shattering into relief so profound it was almost painful. If you continue toward collapse, if the old narratives reassert dominance, we will document your end and depart. We will not interfere with your choices. But if you continue toward transformation, if your new story takes root and grows, we will witness something we have never seen. A species that was told it was doomed and consciously chose a different ending. First contact moved closer to Sarah, and for the first time, she felt something like communication that wasn't symbols or concepts, but pure understanding. You did well, Sarah Chen. You showed us what we were missing. The unmeasured variable, the power of meaning-making. You have given your species a chance we did not give the others. Sarah managed to speak, her voice hoarse from hours of streaming. What happens now? Now? Now you rest. And tomorrow, you, all of you, continue the work of transformation. It will take decades, generations perhaps. There will be setbacks. The old story will not surrender easily, but you have proven something important. Change is possible. And because change is possible, hope is rational. The documentation team began to withdraw their presence, the symbols fading from the air. But first contact remained a moment longer. One final thing. The 31 successful species, they all reached a point where they stopped seeing consciousness as competition and started seeing it as collaboration, where they recognized that intelligence is not about domination, but about understanding. Your word for it is wisdom. That is what we will be watching for. Not your technology, not your power, but whether you choose wisdom over cleverness, whether you become truly intelligent or merely smart. And then, with a shimmer that defied physics, first contact began to fade. Wait, Sarah called out. Will we see you again? The symbols appeared one last time, gentle and somehow warm. When you're ready. When you've earned it. When your new story has become your only story. Until then, look up at night. We'll be there. A reminder that someone believes you're worth the wait. The laboratory returned to normal, or what passed for normal after the world had fundamentally changed. Sarah looked at the camera, at the billion humans still watching, and managed an exhausted smile. I guess we have work to do, she said simply. The comments exploded with affirmation, with questions, with plans, with the beginning of a conversation that would never truly end. Martin turned off the recording equipment, and Sarah finally let herself collapse into her chair. Did we just save the world? He asked quietly. No, Sarah said, closing her eyes. We just gave it permission to save itself. Sarah Chen woke 16 hours later in her own bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Martin had driven her home, she later learned, after she'd fallen asleep mid-sentence during the post-stream debrief. The world she woke to was the same and completely different. Her phone had 847,000 unread messages, a number she recognized immediately and took as either cosmic irony or the documentation team's sense of humor. Martin had screened them, forwarding only the critical ones. Interview requests from every major media outlet, consulting offers from governments and NGOs, speaking invitations from universities, and death threats from people who blamed her for everything from market volatility to the erosion of human exceptionalism. The old story, fighting back. But something had shifted at a fundamental level. She could see it in the news feeds, feel it in the tenor of global conversation. The genetic evidence was now accepted by every credible scientific body. The entities remained visible in orbit, 12 ships, plus First Contact's larger vessel, observable through telescopes, undeniable and patient. And the stories people told themselves were changing, but not everywhere, not all at once. Climate deniers still denied. Nationalists still raged. Conspiracy theorists wove elaborate tales about manipulation and control. But the dominant narrative, the story most people were telling themselves about humanity's place in the universe, had fundamentally transformed. We are not alone had become, we are not exceptional. Growth at all costs was becoming survival through wisdom. Dominion over nature was shifting toward participation with nature. Small changes in language that preceded large changes in behavior. Sarah spent the next 6 months helping establish the Institute for Narrative Transformation, a global collaborative that studied how the 31 successful species had thought their way through the filter. Not their technology, not their solutions, but their frameworks for making decisions, their their values hierarchies, their methods of resolving conflict between short-term desire and long-term survival. The findings were both hopeful and sobering. Every successful species had developed what the researchers termed trans-temporal empathy, the ability to care about beings who didn't exist yet as much as beings who existed now, to make sacrifices for future generations not out of duty, but out of genuine love for consciousness itself. Every successful species had moved from competitive to collaborative models not through force, but through recognition that intelligence itself was too precious to waste on conflict. Every successful species had developed mechanisms to override short-term thinking during crisis, not through authoritarianism, but through genuine transformation of what they valued. It's possible, Sarah told a room full of UN delegates during her 6th testimony. But it's not easy, and it's not inevitable. We're in the narrow window where transformation could happen. Whether it does depends on choices we make right now, today, in this room. Some delegates listened, others dismissed her. The old patterns persistent. But enough, we're listening. Always enough. By the first anniversary of contact, atmospheric CO2 had peaked and begun to decline for the first time in 150 years. Not through miracle technology, but through 10,000 policy changes driven by the new story, by the recognition that the entities were watching, waiting to see what humans would choose. By the second anniversary, the first International Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Future Generations had been established, making amends not for past crimes, but for crimes that hadn't been committed yet, the theft from those not yet born. By the third anniversary, Sarah was teaching at the Institute, training the next generation of narrative architects, people who understood that stories weren't just entertainment or myth, but the operating system of civilization. Change the code, change the output. She was in her office when first contact appeared again, not physically, but as a presence she'd learned to recognize. You have questions? The symbol stated, rather than asked. Always, Sarah said, not bothering to look up from her work. But right now, the big one is, are we going to make it? Are we on track to be the 30-second success? That depends on your definition of success. You have avoided several near-term collapse scenarios. Your atmospheric trajectory is improving. Nuclear tensions have decreased. These are significant achievements. But the transformation is shallow in many places, performative in others. The old story is patient, and power structures adapt slowly. You have bought yourselves time, not guaranteed survival. Sarah finally looked up at where first contact's presence manifested as a slight distortion in the air. If you were betting, what would you bet on? The pause suggested genuine consideration. We do not bet. But if we did, we would bet on the fact that you are asking this question, that after 5 years, you have not become complacent, that your curiosity exceeds your certainty. The failed species became confident they had solved the problem. The successful ones remained permanently uncertain, permanently vigilant, permanently willing to question their own narratives. Your anxiety about success is the best evidence that you might achieve it. Sarah laughed, despite herself. That's deeply unhelpful advice. Wisdom often is. She returned to her work, a paper analyzing narrative resilience during social stress, and felt first contact preparing to withdraw. Hey, she called out. The 31 successful species, do they ever meet each other? Form some kind of community of conscious beings? Yes, when they are ready, when they have nothing left to prove, when they seek not advantage but understanding. And will we? When you're ready, Sarah Chen, when you've earned it, when your species looks at the stars not to conquer but to connect, we will be waiting. The presence faded, leaving Sarah alone with her work and her hope and her awareness that humanity's story was still being written, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one transformation at a time. She opened her laptop and continued writing, adding her voice to the billions working to ensure that when the documentation team finally compiled their report on humanity, it would read not as tragedy, but as transformation. Not as failure number 23, but as success number 32. An abandoned experiment that refused to stay abandoned. A species that was told it was doomed and decided to write a different ending. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not made by telescopes pointed at the stars, but by hearts willing to look inward and ask, what story are we telling ourselves? And is it the story we want to be true? The entities are still watching, still waiting, still curious about whether consciousness can transcend its origins. The answer, as always, depends on what we choose to become.